I shall then only touch at some of the particulars alleged in the Vindication, page 330, to satisfy the reader that his charge of untruth laid against the Presbytery's testimony is both unjust and also an idle wrangling about circumstances that do not affect the confession that the Presbytery make in their act and testimony. And, in the particular instances which I give, I shall observe the same order in which Mr. Currie has laid them in the 8th chapter of his Vindication. Only the reader may notice that the first 3 exceptions which Mr. Currie makes under the testimony are not contained in the act and testimony, but in the introduction to it, which, as I have already observed, is no judicial act indeed, and consequently no part of what is properly called the act and testimony. But since the introduction contains nothing but what is truth and matter of fact, and since it is the deed of all the brethren, though an extrajudicial deed, I shall consider Mr. Currie's instances in the manner, as well as in the order in which he has laid them. The first exception Mr. Currie makes unto the act and testimony is as follows. That is, he alleges it is not truth when the brethren say, quote, "Upon the intimation of the commission's sentence, the ministers therein designed gave in a protestation bearing a secession from the judicatories of this church," unquote. Introduction, page 3. But why is not this truth? Because, says Mr. Currie, quote, "Their secession at that time was only from the prevailing party in this established church, without the least word of making any secession from a judicatory," unquote. To which I answer that I reckon these terms, the prevailing party and the majority of the adjudicatory, terms of the same import and signification, and therefore when a secession is made from the prevailing party or majority of a judicatory, it is a secession from the judicatory itself, seeing the majority of the church representative is still the church representative. Secondly, Mr. Currie alleges it is not a true representation when it is told, introduction, page 3, quote, "When the brethren considered that 4 ministers, being thrust out all at once from ministerial communion with the present judicatories, were a competent number for associating together for the exercise of government and discipline," etc., unquote. Mr. Currie, that he may show that the above is not a true representation, adds, quote, "Had the testimony said 3 instead of 4, it had been a juster account, for 'tis known they were only 3 in number when they did first constitute themselves into a presbytery. Mr. Wilson hath owned to sundry that he wanted clearness to join the Associate Presbytery at their first constitution," unquote. Unto all which I reply, I hope Mr. Currie will allow me to know better what passed among the brethren at their first constitution unto a presbytery, than he can know from any reports made unto him, or from any hearsay stories which he is very forward to publish. And therefore I do not think it amiss to give the reader the following brief history of the seceding minister's constitution at first into a presbytery. The Commission of the General Assembly that met November 1733 passed a sentence against the protesting ministers whereby they cast them out from communion with the present established church. When this sentence was intimate unto them, they gave in a protestation whereby they declared a secession from the judicatories, in the manner that the same is expressed in their said protestation before the Commission at the foresaid time. And when this was done, immediately after they had gone out from the Commission, they agreed among themselves to meet the 5th of December following for humiliation and prayer, in order to ask leading and direction from the Lord with respect to the step that they should next take after they had now declared a secession from the judicatories. The seceding brethren met, according to their above resolution, at the bridge of Garney at the time agreed upon, and the 5th day of December was spent in prayer, humiliation, and conference together concerning the present providences of God towards them. They agreed to meet again the following day for prayer and conference, when the following question was proposed: whether or not it was their duty in their present situation, when the present judicatories had cast them out from communion with them, and when they had, upon just and necessary grounds, declared a secession from them, to constitute themselves into a presbytery. There was much and serious reasoning upon both sides of the question. They endeavored in their reasoning to compare the Word of God and His providences toward them together, and after prayer and reasoning upon the same, the question was put, constitute presently into a presbytery or not? And the 4 brethren did all with one voice give it as their judgment that they should constitute presently into a presbytery. And the Reverend Mr. Ebenezer Erskine was, by their unanimous consent, desired to be their mouth to the Lord in this solemn action, and he was enabled with much enlargement of soul to consecrate and dedicate them to the Lord and to the service of his church, particularly of his broken and oppressed heritage and the present situation into which, by the holy and wise providence of God, they were brought. And after prayer, he was chosen moderator of their presbytery. I shall only make two observes upon what passed at this time. The one is that the Presbyterial Association was not a rash and inconsiderate deed at first. Near 2 days were spent in prayer and serious reasoning upon this head, wherein, as I have observed already, the seceding ministers endeavored to compare the word and providences of God together. Again, in their meeting on the foresaid days, particularly in their Presbyterial Constitution, I hope they felt and experienced something of the Lord's gracious countenance and special presence. Two reverend brethren, Masters Ralph Erskine and Thomas Mayer, were witnesses to all that passed the 2 days mentioned. They were not then in conjunction with the four ministers in secession from the judicatories, but the Lord afterwards cleared their way to join them. After the seceding ministers had constituted presbyterially, they unanimously agreed that they would not be sudden in proceeding to any acts or jurisdiction, but resolved before any such procedure to wait if the judicatories of the church would return to our Reformation standards, and therefore they held their presbyterial meetings for some time after their first erection and constitution, mainly for asking counsel of the Lord, and for mutual advice, and for strengthening one another's hands in the work of the Lord, as is reported. Introduction to the Testimony, page 5. After the meeting of Assembly, 1735, when the brethren observed the conduct of the said Assembly, and that no steps were taken towards Reformation, 3 of the seceding ministers were then clear to proceed immediately to the exercise of the keys of government and discipline, but at that time Mr. Wilson was not clear for taking the step, but was of opinion that they should only hold their meetings as they had done the former year, namely for mutual advice in their present situation, for strengthening one another's hands in the work of the Lord. And indeed, this was the one material difference that was amongst that little body after their secession from judicatories. But, by the good hand of the Lord upon them, they were kept unite among themselves. The other 3 brethren, who were clear for the above procedure, did not proceed to any step of jurisdiction, and nothing of this nature was done till after the Assembly, 1736, when all the 4 brethren were convinced that not only it was duty, but also that it was high time for them to proceed to the exercise of the keys of government and discipline. The reasons of their procedure after the Assembly, 1736, are hinted at in the foresaid introduction, page 7. I am in no concert with my brethren in the above historical account which I give. Neither do any of them know what I write at the time, and 'tis probable will not know till it comes abroad from the press. But I judged it my duty to give the above plain and impartial account, not only to rectify Mr. Currie's above mistakes, founded upon hearsays or stories reported to him, but also for the information of others in regard that, whatever the effect of our present Presbyterial Association may be, or whatever may be the after conduct and behavior of any of the brethren associate together, it may however appear that our Presbyterial Constitution was entered into in a deliberate manner, and with the concurrence of all concerned. Thirdly, Mr. Currie alleges, quote, "'Tis not truth when the brethren say, Independents lodge the keys of government and discipline in the whole community of the faithful, as introduction, page 4, the Act and Testimony, page 100, unquote. The reason Mr. Currie gives why he thinks this is not truth is because the words of the testimony bear that this was the opinion of them all, or the generality of the independents, and he says, "'Tis not fact that this is the received principle of the generality of independents, to which I briefly answer, that the brethren express themselves in the same manner that the London ministers do in their preface to that excellent book, Just Divinum Reg Ecclesiastic, where, showing the difference between the Presbyterian and Independent way, and the excellency of the former above the latter, they say, quote, the Independents hold that subject of church government is the Satis Fidelum, or community of the faithful, unquote. And I do not think that I speak by way of disparagement to Mr. Currie when I affirm that the London ministers knew as well how to express the principles of the Independents as Mr. Currie does. After all, the books he has read or turned over. I must add further, that when Mr. Currie alleges that the brethren's words bear that the above was the opinion of all the independents, or the generality of them, he does not quote the brethren's words fairly, for they bear no such thing. Their words, introduction page 4, are, quote, "They also judged it necessary for them to enter into a presbyterial association, not only for maintaining that order among themselves which is required by the word of God, but also to distinguish themselves from these of the sectarian and independent way, who lodge the keys of government and discipline in the whole community of the faithful." Unquote. Now, when the brethren say, to distinguish themselves from these of the sectarian and independent way, I humbly judge no reasonable man will say that the brethren's words do bear, that all or the generality of the independents maintain the principle above mentioned. Fourthly, "'Tis not fact," says Mr. Currie, quote, when in their Act and Testimony, page 18, they say, "The Church of Scotland in 1638 began where former Reformation had stopped," unquote. And why is this not fact? Because, says Mr. Currie, quote, "This is an insinuation, as if formerly she had not been reformed from prelacy," unquote. But if Mr. Currie had not curtailed the words of the Act and Testimony, his reader would have easily seen that the words import no such thing as Mr. Currie alleges. The words of the Act and Testimony are, quote, "When, by a surprising and wonderful appearance of divine providence, this church was delivered from the brink of ruin in the year 1638, the judicatories of the church pulled down and carried off the rubbish of defection, where they began where former Reformation had stopped, and went forward in building and beautifying the house of God," unquote. What was this rubbish of defection that was pulled down and carried off? Was it not prelacy and the 5 Articles of Perth? Was not the Reformation stopped by the introduction of prelacy? Did not the Assembly 1638 begin where former Reformation had stopped when they condemned prelacy and declared that it was abjured by our national covenant? Did not the judicatories of this church go forward in building and beautifying the house of the Lord in the several particular instances mentioned in the close of the preceding chapter? But Mr. Currie must turn over every stone to force a lie upon the Judicial Act and Testimony. Fifthly, Mr. Currie says, "It is not truth, which is asserted, Act and Testimony, page 34, that is, quote, that the principal articles of Mr. Rennick's indictment, for which he suffered, were his affirming that the Duke of York, then King James VII, was not rightful and lawful king of these realms, and that because he was a papist, he had never sworn the coronation oath, and was overthrowing the fundamental laws of the kingdom, also his affirming and defending the lawfulness of defensive arms, both for our civil and religious liberties," unquote. Upon this, Woodrow's history is quoted, volume 2, pages 632 and 633. I have narrated the words of the Act and Testimony full. Mr. Currie curtails them, whereby his reader cannot so well understand them. But what untruth is in the above words? Says Mr. Currie, quote, "In Mr. Rennick's indictment there are no such words as these recorded by Mr. Woodrow, as the above words printed in italic," unquote. To which I reply, though I have followed Mr. Currie in printing the above words in italic, yet they are not all printed in italic in the Presbyterian's Act and Testimony, neither are they laid in such a way and manner as they were the express words of the indictment. Any who considers the above words will easily see that the Presbyterian intends them only as an illustration of the first article mentioned, for which that worthy minister was indicted. And here I might justly return to Mr. Currie one of his own proverbial sayings, "He wants but a hair to make a teacher." Sixthly, Mr. Currie asserts that it is not truth nor matter of fact for any to assert it is one of the principles espoused by this church that because one is a papist, he cannot be rightfully and lawfully king of these realms, as is alleged. Act and Testimony, page 34. But Mr. Currie has not told the words of the testimony in which the above alleged untruth is expressed, and therefore I must report them. They immediately follow the words above narrated concerning Mr. Rennick's indictment, and they are, "These principles were espoused by this church ever since our reformation from popery, and were justified by all the 3 nations at the Revolution." And what are the principles which the Presbytery affirm have been espoused by this church ever since the Reformation? They are the principles mentioned in the preceding head, that is, Mr. Rennick's affirming the lawfulness of defensive arms in the manner expressed above, as also his affirming that the Duke of York was not lawful or rightful king of these realms because he was a papist and because he had never sworn the coronation oath and was overthrowing the fundamental laws of the kingdom.